Hello and welcome to Paul's Podcast. This is a new podcast I'm creating where I talk to different YouTubers about different subjects. This week I'm talking to LawrenceWalles about space, and I'll have a link in the description to his channel, and hopefully you'll enjoy what you hear. I'm not quite sure how often I'll be doing these, but I'll try and put them up in a regular pattern, maybe once a week, once a month, something like that. So without further ado, here it is. Oh, okay. Yeah, we're starting now. Okay, cool. Okay, so the question I want to discuss with you today, Lawrence, Narwhal, whatever your name is.
Lawrence.
Lawrence?
Wallace.
Lawrence of Arabia?
No, Lawrence Wallace.
Lawrence Wallace.
Because I am the Lorewall. Cuckoo cuckoo.
You
Yes.
You want to get sued?
No.
That's how you get sued.
That's not how you get sued.
That is how you get sued.
It's a paraphrased reference.
It's
under free use. We as YouTubers
Michael
know much
Jackson
about this.
will sue you.
That has nothing to do with it. Like
Michael Jackson owns all the Beatles stuff.
All right. Well, let's restart this bit cuz yeah.
I'm not restarting.
Oh, okay.
This is being left in.
Oh no, well I'm just saying let's restart so we
up.
can get a cleaner beginning.
Nope,
so that way the people listening to this aren't just like, what are they doing?
Nope, you fucked up.
Oh, okay.
It's in. Anyways, so today I want to discuss with you the question. Do you think it's possible to set up a self-sustaining colony in space within the next 50 years? So I'm assuming you did some sort of research, maybe, hopefully. If not, that's totally fine.
You think I do research on these things?
I mean,
hilarious.
I mean, you can. I didn't.
Oh,
Maybe.
okay. Well, we now know this is going to be an educated podcast.
Well, it's semi-educated.
Well, I mean, this was kind of the topic for forensics, like the Lincoln Douglas debate, sort of. Theirs was just shush yourself.
You don't need to know that.
Well, space colonization was still.
I said be quiet.
Okay.
Anyways, so Lawrence, do you think it's possible? Yes, no, and or why?
Well, that's a little different than the question you posed as a hypothetical to me earlier, but it would really depend on how we're defining it, because when you say self-sustaining, what do you mean by that?
Well, like, America is self-sustaining. Even though we do imports and exports, we are still self-sustaining.
Okay. That doesn't really tell me much about self-sustaining. That just tells me something that kind of
you're able to make your own food and fix a majority of your own problems without outside influences or whatever have you.
I would say, like, along those lines then, I would say within the next 50 years, it's, as long as technology keeps going on the up and up from where it is right now, that it would be possible, though we'd probably be seeing it closer to the end of the 50 years rather than sooner. But I think it would be a lot farther out, because it's reaching a lot farther out. Do I think we could colonize Mars a lot sooner than that? I think probably within the next 40 years we could sufficiently colonize Mars, but do I think that we would be able to have a fully self-sustaining colony on Mars? That one I think is a little bit more of a stretch, but still possible. Because there's also the travel time between, because it's at least an 8-month journey. So, that really only gives you enough time for, like, what is it, like 25 trips roughly, maybe a little bit more, that you would actually be able to get out there and back. So you don't have a lot of wiggle room as far as time is concerned to be able to get stuff out there and technology out there to create the self-sustaining colony.
Yeah.
Not to mention, there's a lot of difficulty as far as human reproduction is concerned, because we humans have never reproduced even more than a single generation in space. To my knowledge,
I don't think we've had any
have never had a
babies.
baby in space.
Yeah.
I mean, that sounds kind of a
Well, I
ridiculous
mean,
claim. Like, I think humans can have babies in space.
well, like the thing though is like if we were doing something like that, like let's use Mars for an example, or even the moon, like there's
Right.
still gravity and stuff. So, I mean, there would be, of course, the problems with labor and the actual development stages.
Right.
Also, too, like the thing is, like you can only send stuff from Earth to Mars when you're in like that optimal time.
Right.
So like even then, like you'd have even less trips to do. And I just looked it up right now because I have the almighty Google in front of me. Yeah, 6 to 8
Ah.
months, depending on where you're at.
Right.
So, I mean, yeah, that's like the thing though is I think we can do it. Actually, I think we could do it even sooner than the later in the 50 years. I feel like we could do it in like the 5 years because I mean, think of all the technology and stuff we have right now. Like we have shit like Miracle Grow, where we can
Yeah.
have like fucking completely saturated soil where there's like you know a calcium deposit like 12 feet under. Like here in California we have that a calcium deposit where you have to like drill through to get stuff, but if we throw Miracle Grow on top we can have a beautiful garden.
Right.
And because it just throws all that stuff in there, so I feel like if we continue with this agricultural growth that we have, we could in the next 25-30 years, if we actually get this going, get a at least small self-sustaining colony. Nothing huge, nothing like 10 or 20,000 people, but something small like 30, 40, 50 people.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the other things, though, that might delay the development is more than just the technology, but because of the philosophy, and there's a lot of apprehension towards colonizing space.
Mm.
I think that those mindsets and thoughts would hold development on that back a little bit, which may not necessarily be a bad thing. I mean, personally, I think we, as a human race, have a great difficulty taking care of the current planet that we have, let alone going off and dealing with other planets. I don't know that we've necessarily demonstrated enough responsibility with what we already have to actually go out and start dealing with other planets. So I think those ideas will also play a factor in the development towards that direction, which
Yeah.
would affect whether or not we'd actually be able to do it within that time frame.
Well, I mean, like with things like that, you always have variables that could um, delay or basically throw you for a loop.
Right.
Like the thing about it is though, like let's say in the next 15 years, right? We're gonna have like a lot more technology than we have now. I mean, think about how much we had since the 2000s. In the 2000s, we barely had, these little brick cell phones, and now we have cell phones where we can literally FaceTime somebody from across the planet. And I think little things like that really shows where we're moving as a species. And I think with the pressure to, I guess, like get off the rock, as some people would say, and because we have so many people here on Earth that getting out into space and being able to mine and colonize would really shove you out there, whether those variables are a factor or not.
Right.
So,
I think that's definitely true to a certain extent, but I think one of the major differences between like the FaceTiming across the globe and stuff, there aren't huge philosophical and kind of responsibility arguments against FaceTiming someone across the globe,
oh
whereas like
yeah,
with colonizing other planets, it's a much bigger issue, and so it's a lot harder. Apart from people who really like science and they get on the bandwagon of doing it, it's a lot harder to convince the mass population that we should even be doing something like that. But I think, in addition to that, one of the other things we should define is when you say, do you think we could do this? Do you mean we as the human race, or we as America, or we as in who, basically?
I mean we as in the human race as a whole. Like, it doesn't matter if it's Russia or China or America or the UK or Australia or North Korea. Like, just as a human race, do you think it's possible that we can do this? Now, more than likely, it is going to be some sort of combination of like America, UK, Germany, like some weird mix there.
Why you gotta only do Western nations, man?
Okay, Saudi Arabia.
Because the obligatory Middle East, right?
Yeah, there we go. But no, but I really think that, like, well, I mean, if you think about it, it's probably gonna be Western nations too, anyways. But
now, I think China has a pretty big development towards space colonization. I mean, if you're gonna make a population argument, I think China would have the biggest press on the population
well, I mean,
issue
that's
because
like
they
saying,
have so many.
That's like saying, you know, that if that's the case, then India even more so, because they have like what, half the size? They're half the size
Right,
physically
to my knowledge, the world's
China.
most,
And like have even more than the Chinese have in population wise. So I mean, if you're gonna make that argument, I might as well just say, you know, India. Or how about we go even smaller, Manhattan.
Potentially, except for Manhattan doesn't have its own government-funded space program, whereas India and China actually do have their own funded programs. Though, I believe
New Yorkers are crafty, is all I'm saying.
Yeah, but you know what? As crafty as they are, I don't think they're crafting rocket ships to get out of, or other spacecrafts. Though there are some who wear tinfoil hats, as with everywhere else in the world. Yeah, they're not crafting spacecrafts to get out there. I don't know the status of India's space program, or even if they have a space program, but I do know that China does have a space program, and they are pushing towards development of space. Or of outer space.
Okay, so according to telegraph.co.uk, India does have a space program.
Ah, okay. So then I would say it really depends on their country's economic status as to if they're able to fund, which one is better able to fund it.
Yeah.
Because I would say that each of them have a precedent at that point to heavily push towards space development, but I don't necessarily know that India would be able to outfund China. Simply because the U.S. does so much trading with China, they have a much larger slice of the global economy.
Well, I mean, like, the whole thing, though, is, like, it really doesn't matter who does it. Like, just the fact that I don't think it's going to be a single nation that does it. I think it's going to be a combination of at least 3 or 4 nations, if not something probably more likely like 15.
Okay.
And
yeah, I can...
Yeah, and I feel like most of them will be Western European or North American nations. Like, you know, Canada, America, UK, Germany, Sweden, shit like that.
Right. And I definitely think that, like, as a globe and stuff, every nation is going to contribute, whether small or large, to the development of space. But I definitely think that if we pushed all out to get there, I definitely think it would be towards the later end of the 50 years rather than the 20 years from now, because if you look at how technology is developing, we're developing a lot more. But if you want to develop a self-sustaining colony on a place that we've never actually had humans even be yet. I mean, I know that there is a program set out to actually take people to Mars and basically have those people live in a colony and die on Mars for like however long they live out there.
Yeah.
They just drop them off in a Martian wasteland and they're like, I can't breathe.
Well, have fun, kids.
Exactly. No, but I definitely think that it would be, to get a self-sustaining, like a fully self-sustaining one, that's the threshold is greater on that than just to have a colony out there. I mean, you could have a completely dysfunctional colony out there and you could get that within the 50 years easily.
Yeah,
but I would say to have the self-sustaining colony, it would take more time and more research, because it's basically like saying, hey, could we have a self-sustaining colony at the bottom of the deepest part of the ocean within the next 50 years? It's like, Maybe, but we haven't really been there. So that's like, how exactly are we supposed to go there? Anything we send there gets crushed.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Oh no. Yeah. No. You bring up really good, valid points.
but you're
Just like,
wrong.
no, it's just I feel like if something like doesn't take away from the focus of it, we could really do this as a species. I really do think within the 50 years we could do this, and I feel like we could be successful. Now, am I saying that the first sustaining colony is gonna be like flourishing? Hell no, they're probably gonna die off like really fast. But
because that's totally what self-sustaining means.
well, I mean, like just random asteroid belt or Martian Indians or something. But
What?
but but I do think we could do this, and I feel like we have the technology and the current global drive to do it.
True. But that, of course, that's all inductive reasoning based on like our current trend of things. You're seeing the way
Yeah.
things are currently developing and assuming that none of the factors will wane anywhere. I mean, if the US ends up getting in some kind of a war where another war where it's of a large scale conflict, or if Russia starts up a lot more of the stuff with Ukraine and we end up getting derailed off of the
Yeah.
space development, then it's quite possible that we would be delayed even more than the 50 years. But there's arguments that you could like make Cold War arguments that for the space race, where now because
Yeah.
we have these wars going on, we're pushing to get out in space. But I think the reason why they pushed so hard with the space race was to be able to gain dominance over the other nation by having like stuff on the moon where you'd have the laser bases set up and you could basically take out whoever, like you remember Reagan's Star Wars and
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
So uh basically stuff like that. But I think since we've already, like, people were rushing for the first taste of outer space, and so that's why they were pushing so hard to get to it, because it's so monumental. They've already breached the gap there to get to space, so it's not as big of a deal. Even though getting to another planet is a huge deal, it's
Mhm.
not as big of a deal as getting out into there. Like, making the first boat is a way bigger accomplishment than sailing the ocean blue, because at that point you're standing on the shoulders of giants. Like, yes, your accomplishment is amazing, but if it was not for that first accomplishment, you wouldn't have been able to get out there. Oh, sorry, you would not have been able to get out there. That was my hand hitting the desk that my mic was on without. I didn't even put a lot of force into it. I just like put my hand down in a downward motion instead of an upward motion, and it smacked the desk.
That's fine. This just adds emphasis. Just
And
like,
it adds emphasis.
that's
And
what I said. Hey, it
eminence.
took me a second, but I said it. All right.
Okay.
But for your whole thing on how the analogy of the first ship and then sailing the ocean blue, I feel like it's just as big as an accomplishment, because you're taking something simple and then doing something great with it. Now, it is true that without the first thing, you can't do it, but now you're taking it to greater heights than it was ever actually intended for. We were just trying to get into outer space, true, but now we're trying to get to another planet. We're trying to make science fiction science.
Right.
So I feel like that in itself is just as big as an accomplishment as getting out there as we did in like the 60s when we first landed on the moon. I feel like when we set up the first colony on the moon or Mars or an asteroid or wherever, I feel
Right.
like that'll be just as big as an accomplishment, because it'll show what our progression is like, and it'll show like the dedication that we put in just as much as we did in the 60s. So to say like it's not as big, I'm gonna have to like
Disagree.
yeah, I'm gonna have to disagree with you on that.
Okay.
But I do understand where you are coming from. Like, I can totally see where you can make that connection.
Yeah. One of the other things to think about as well that kind of separates the Cold War mentality a little bit from the current situation as far as developing space is that in the Cold War situation, there was a huge push for nationalism. in getting like our nation will be the first one to get out there, and that's what gave it a lot of the drive, was our nation will be the first to get out there. But I think if we're doing a collaborative part, then that might be a little bit more difficult to achieve that same level of drive, because in the other there was more of a warlike competition going on, but in this case it would be a peaceful development, so I don't know that it would have the same like funding and backing to go into it. But on
Well,
top of that, or just one moment. On top
okay,
of
go
that,
ahead.
I think there's also, if that nationalism were to rise up again, even within the groups, there might be some sabotage that goes on, so that way America or India or whoever the groups are that are working together, one of them can claim more glory over the others. It's like, well, we're going to steal what you guys have done here and we're going to use it for ourselves, because at that point it's not really the interest of humanity that's involved, but national recognition throughout the rest of the world.
Well, like that, I don't think the glory thing really matters anymore. Because I mean, think of all the group efforts we put into a lot of things. Like, lots of countries band together to do lots of things without one trying to take all the glory. And like when you say it's nationalism trying to get out, well, that's what the whole point was. It's multiple countries. It's not one country, and there is a huge push because look at all the different nations doing this. It's not just America. You
Right.
know, it's America, it's Russia, it's possibly even India. Like all these countries are trying to push for this, and they're getting huge funding for this, and it's a huge national attention. And like just like in the 60s when we were saying go to space, go to space, go to space, well, look at what's on TV. Cosmos, Nova, PBS, everybody's talking go to space, go to space, and that we have that same mentality. And it's not about nationalism now, it's more like get off the rock, because look at what we're on. Like we're on the brink of war constantly. Our environment's really screwed up right now. California's in a drought, which holds a shit ton of the world's food. And it's like to get off the rock would and get a self-sustaining colony would solve some of those problems. Like I'm not saying it's like an instant cure and all of a sudden everything's gonna be great, but like it would show that we have the ability to do this. And I feel like we do have that dedication, and I feel like we can do it within the next 50 years without going 50 years. I feel like we can do that in something like 2040.
Right. Um, well, for what I was saying with the nationalism, that has to do with the scenario where the nationalism does creep up within those collaborative groups.
No, of
And
course.
right, so I'm not saying that it will necessarily happen, but I'm saying if that was to happen for the nationalism, then those would be the effects of it. But as far as like the no one nation wanting to take the glory, I think that like even within those collaborative groups, there still is some level of that. I mean, the U.S. is uh, pretty heavily focused on getting a lot of its own glory, and I don't say that necessarily to like downplay the US, but it's a pretty obvious thing to a lot of people in the US as well as a lot of people outside the US that our government tends to like glory.
Yeah.
But one of the other factors that we're not really considering or we haven't discussed yet is a push towards the private market doing something like this. Because, I mean, whereas we can put a lot of funding into development of technologies and stuff like that through government means, like I think the best technology would be developed through the private market, because not only would we have additional uses come up for that technology, but we would
Mm-hmm.
also be able to develop it the most efficiently, which means we're reducing the amount of resources that go into it. But on top of that, you can't just keep funding basically a sinking ship. So they would have to adjust how they're doing things. They would have to basically correct their mistakes a lot quicker. Uh, and so I think that would actually push the development of space a lot faster. So I think actually having government funding of space exploration would actually be more of a hindrance to developing the technology necessary to get us out there. But then there's also a lot of issues when you have the governments going out there. Um, what happens as far as like what laws are they under? Do they create their own laws like we did with the when the colonists came to the American continent and they did the Mayflower Compact? Would it be something like that? Or would they be under American law? Would they be under international law? Does that bring up interplanetary law?
Hmm. Yeah, you do bring up a lot of good topics. The whole law thing, like, that's something that would have to be, like, addressed at some point. And another thing, too, like, is the private sector, because we didn't really have a private sector before going into space, and now
Right.
we really got, like, multiple millionaire, billionaire people, tycoon types trying to, you know, get out into space. And, it brings up a lot of questions, and, I feel like the government's collective effort could really set a precedent. So if we were to get out there first and do it, and then every other company could say, "Oh, that's how you do it," because I feel like if private companies were to do it themselves, a lot of people could end up dying.
Yeah.
So,
Just a little.
yeah, and I feel like the government would take just a little bit more precaution than a couple of rich people. So, but yeah. So do you have anything else to add?
Well, repeat your question, like the topic question, just so I make sure I've got all the parts in it.
All right. Do you think it's possible to set up a self-sustaining colony in space in the next 50 years?
Okay. So it was in space, not specifically on Mars then.
Not specifically on Mars, but like off of Earth.
Oh, okay. Then I would definitely say for the moon colonies to have something like that, that could easily be accomplished within 30 years. Just because they're already developing the ability to grow plants on the moon. That was actually an article that came up, was they're looking at developing that. Um, but also, I think because we're a lot closer to the moon, the conditions are a lot less hostile
Yeah.
on the moon than out on Mars.
Yeah.
Plus, we can get there in like, what is it, a week?
Yeah, it's pretty easy to get to the moon nowadays.
Yeah, I would, and also there's a lot less fuel involved.
Hmm.
I think the threshold for colonizing the moon is way lower than it would be for Mars. I don't. It must have been in the other question, you like the hypothetical question that you put out, that Mars was involved.
Yeah.
So, then yeah, I would say, I mean, a lot of the same stuff that I was talking about before still applies. But I think that there would be some level of, I think it would be a lot easier to colonize the moon than to colonize Mars.
Okay.
Yeah, and I mean, there's also, since you said space, it doesn't even necessarily have to be, the colony doesn't even necessarily have to be on a planet. It could just
No.
be a colony out in outer space, floating
Yeah.
around.
Yeah, that's why I was like, you could put one on Mars, Moon, asteroid. You could put it.
Well, it doesn't even
you
have
could just
to
make a
be.
space station.
Yeah, I was gonna say, it doesn't
Yeah.
even have to be on a solid mass. It could just
Yeah.
be floating out there, free floating.
All right.
So, um, yeah, I think that would be, those types of situations would be a lot more plausible. Now, I think long run, I mean, we'd have to really figure out what our time frame would be to count self-sustaining would be.
Yeah.
Like, do we measure self-sustaining like by 15 years, 10 years of being able to sustain itself without like breaking down too many times, or like without causing defects within the human people that are up there? Because I mean, if like after 2 3 generations of people being born on that colony and they're all deformed and they can't do anything, and they try to leave that colony and come back to Earth, and then they're basically just deformed cripples because they can't deal with the gravity, I think that would like be a legitimate concern.
Yeah, well, that would take quite a few generations to do that, because
Right.
we are born with X amount of muscle mass and X variable of growing it. So
Right. No, that's true. But I think like after so many generations of being in space, I mean, it'd be very similar to like Wall-E, the movie, where like it shows the generations and their
yeah,
bone mass just massively deteriorates. Now, that's not really because they're out in space. That's because they're in the floaty chairs, but and they got really lazy. But the
yeah,
point is that the being in space like that, and I mean, we'd also have to be able to figure out how to create our own gravity, because without having that additional gravity, to like keep us strong, as it were, then that would be a big problem.
Well, yeah. Well, with all the articles and things coming out now with gravitational theory and all that, we're getting closer and closer to creating our own gravity.
Right.
Yeah, there are several theories that just came out, and several people trying to create it, and then plus we're learning a lot. So
Right.
but
And I mean, any physical object we put out there is going to have some level of gravitational pull. I mean,
oh yeah, yeah.
that was one of the things that I was learning in my astronomy class over the summer. Not that I'm like completely ignorant of science and everything, but no, it's just I took an astronomy class over the summer, and they brought up a fairly famous experiment that I can't remember the name of at the moment. But basically, the guy took two, I think it was like one was a 10-pound weight and the other was a 15-pound weight or something to that effect, had them suspended and did all this meticulous work to make sure that there was no like air movement or whatever. But he basically had it set up so it was completely, there was no tension on the wires or anything, but the weights or the spheres ended up moving of almost of their own volition, as it were, and they started to basically rotate.
Yeah.
And he did tons of experiments, repeating this over and over to make sure that it wasn't some other type of error that he had. And it basically turns out that all objects have some level of gravity. And I mean, any science student listening to this should know this stuff easily.
Yeah, like.
But for those lowly people who have not, like myself, before the last 2 years, who hadn't really studied any science.
Really?
Yeah, science. I mean, I knew a lot of science information, but I'd never taken a formalized class in science.
Oh,
okay. Yeah, I mean, it's just not something that came up for my education. As far as a formalized class, I'd still done a lot of like sciencey stuff, but as far as like actually learning about former experiments that other scientists had done, yeah, that wasn't a big part of my education.
All right.
So yeah, I think the gravity would be a huge factor to determining a self-sustaining colony.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of factors. I mean, you got food, waste, repairs, gravity,
waste,
inertia.
You just launch out into space, and then aliens find our giant blue poop whatevers.
Containers or whatever.
Our giant blue poop asteroids flying out.
And that's
space.
Another thing. When I say containers, I thought of air tanks, oxygen and all that stuff. So
yeah, but I mean, you'd also have to develop an atmosphere, which that's not necessarily technology that's been properly developed yet.
Yeah, but I mean, no, things are gonna take a long time. But I feel like in the next 30 years or so, we could feasibly do it. So. All right, well, Lawrence, it was really awesome talking to you about this. You did raise up a couple questions I hadn't actually thought of, and I feel like there was some good dialogue here. We're both college-educated people, and so I feel like we had a decent dialogue about this.
Yeah, I would agree. So,
all right.
I think you brought up a fair amount of decent points as well that I also hadn't considered. So, yeah, I enjoyed this. We should do this again sometime.
We definitely will. So awesome talking to you, and I will see you later.
All right. Thanks, Paul.
Okay, and that was my conversation with LawrenceWalles. If you want to check out his channel, look in the description below for the link to his videos. And go ahead and hit that like button if you really enjoyed this. Also, if you have any comments or questions or even suggestions for future podcasts, go ahead and leave those in the comments section. Thank you very much, and have a spacey day.